The sound cut through everything. Not a gunshot, not an explosion. A slap, open-palmed, sharp as a whip crack, that rolled across the parade ground at Fort Iron Ridge and silenced 8,000 people in the time it takes a heart to skip a beat. The Admiral's hand was still raised. The woman he'd struck hadn't moved. She stood in blood-stained scrubs, hair plastered to her face, IV bag clutched in one fist and a trauma kit in the other, and she looked at him the way a person looks at something they've already decided how to handle. "Step away from that helicopter," Admiral Voss Carrington repeated. His voice carried the particular authority of a man who had never once been told no. Lieutenant Nora Hayes turned back toward the aircraft. "Move," she said quietly, "or he dies." Nobody knew who she really was. Not yet. And if this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, follow along so you don't miss a single part, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. The morning had started wrong in the way that only military mornings can. Not dramatically, not with any single obvious failure, but with a dozen small things grinding against each other until the whole machine began to wobble. Fort Iron Ridge sat on the western edge of Raven Falls, Nevada, where the desert flattened out and the sky came down hard and bright, like a lid being pressed onto everything beneath it. The base was mid-sized by Army standards, home to roughly 4,000 permanent personnel and another 4,000 cycling through on rotation, training, or reassignment. It was the kind of installation where procedure mattered more than personality, where rank was a language everyone understood fluently, and where anything that disrupted the ordered flow of military life was treated less like a problem to solve and more like an offense to punish. On the morning of September 14th, Fort Iron Ridge was hosting its semi-annual Joint Forces Readiness Review, a full formation ceremony that pulled in observers from across 3 branches, 2 Pentagon liaisons, and one very important admiral who had driven the entire logistics staff to the edge of breakdown for the past 72 hours. Admiral Voss Carrington was 61 years old, silver-haired, square-jawed, and possessed of the kind of physical confidence that came from 4 decades of people moving out of his way. He was not cruel in any calculated sense. He was something more difficult to argue with. He was certain. Certain that ceremony mattered. Certain that discipline was the spine of military excellence. Certain that his timeline, the inspection, the formation review, the address to 8,000 assembled personnel, was the most important thing happening on this base today. He was wrong about that last part. Nora Hayes had been awake for 19 hours when the call came in. She was in the trauma bay of Fort Iron Ridge's Level 2 medical facility, which was officially called the Keating Medical Operations Center, but which everyone on base just called the KMO, finishing a wound irrigation on a ranger who'd managed to slice his forearm clean to the bone during a training exercise involving a rappelling line and a very bad decision. The ranger, 23 years old, embarrassed about the whole thing, kept trying to look at his own arm with clinical detachment and kept failing. "Don't I?" Nora said without looking up from her work. "I wasn't." "You were about to. Don't." The ranger settled back. Nora finished irrigating, examined the wound depth, and began closure. She was 34, medium height, built like someone who had spent years doing physical work, rather than working out for aesthetics. Her hands were steady, in the particular way of someone who had learned steadiness under conditions that made it very hard to be steady. The KMO lights were harsh and white, and she hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 400, but none of that registered as a problem because she was working, and when she was working, the rest of it just became background noise. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. She ignored that too. The third buzz was a different pattern, the one she'd set to cut through. And she glanced at the screen without stopping her suturing. The message was 4 words. "Mercer is going down." She tied off the suture. "You're done," she told the ranger. "Dressing change in 24 hours. Keep it dry." "Yes, ma'am." She was already moving. Staff Sergeant Dylan Mercer was 38 years old and had been on base for 11 days following an insertion she wasn't supposed to know anything about and a retrieval that had gone sideways in a way that nobody on the official side had been briefed on yet. He was being held in a transit medical room on the facility's east wing, Not officially admitted, not officially on the base roster, tucked into a room that didn't show up on the standard patient manifest. When Nora pushed through the door, the medic on duty, a young specialist named Atwood, was already on the phone, voice tight with the specific stress of someone who knows something is wrong but doesn't have the rank to do anything about it. "His pressure's dropping," Atwood said, which was the understatement of the morning. The monitors above the bed were not telling a good story. Mercer's systolic was sitting at 72 and heading in the wrong direction. His breathing was shallow, his color was the kind of gray that happens right before critical. When did this start? Nora was already at the bedside, hands moving, assessment running. "Past 40 minutes. I called the attending and he said to monitor, and where's the attending?" Atwood's expression said everything. "Ceremony prep. He said unless it was—" Nora was no longer listening. She had her fingers at Mercer's neck, reading his pulse, lifting an eyelid, checking responses. "He's bleeding internally. Get me a cart and call the OR." "OR's on reduced staff because of the—" "I know about the ceremony." Her voice didn't rise, it just compressed. "Call the OR." She grabbed her phone and made 2 calls while assembling what she needed from the supply cabinet, moving with an efficiency that was completely at odds with the amount of time she'd been awake. The first call connected immediately. The second didn't connect at all, which told her something important about what was happening in the next room over on the classified side of the facility. Mercer's eyes opened. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is very sick and has spent enough time around danger to know exactly how sick he is. "Hey," he said. "Don't talk." "Is it—" "I said don't talk. Save it." He closed his eyes. His lips moved slightly. She didn't try to read them. "I need a helicopter," she said to Atwood. "There's a surgical facility at Northgate Regional that can handle what he needs. We can't do this here." Atwood stared at her. "The flight line is locked down for the ceremony. Admiral's orders. No aircraft movement during the formation." Nora looked at him for a moment, then she grabbed the IV bag, the trauma kit, and the portable monitor leads and said, "Get a gurney, boss." The parade ground at Fort Iron Ridge was a 1/4 mile of flat asphalt, capable of holding a full regiment in formation, which was what it was currently doing. 8,000 personnel in dress uniforms stood in the kind of precise geometric arrangement that took weeks of rehearsal and represented the military's highest expression of collective discipline. The stands along the eastern edge held civilian observers, Pentagon staff, and several dozen media personnel who had been vetted, credentialed, and reminded 3 separate times that photography during the formal address was restricted. Admiral Carrington was mid-sentence in his prepared remarks when the gurney came through the east gate. He didn't stop speaking immediately. He was aware of the movement at the periphery. Someone moving across the asphalt at the edge of the formation, something wheeled, a figure in scrubs, and his mind categorized it as a problem to address after the next paragraph. Then the gurney changed course, cutting directly toward the aircraft that was parked at the far end of the ground. A Lakota medical helicopter, assigned to ceremony standby, which was also the closest flyable aircraft to Northgate Regional. The Admiral handed his notes to the aide beside him and stepped off the platform. He covered the distance quickly for a man his age. Part of the crowd shifted, subtle as a tide change. The 8,000 standing in formation kept their eyes forward because that's what you did. But human peripheral vision is a stubborn thing, and 8,000 sets of it tracked what was happening. "Hold." His voice carried the kind of projection that doesn't require volume. The figure in scrubs didn't stop. "I said hold." Nora Hayes registered the voice. She calculated, in the approximately 3/4 of a second it took her to cover another 4 steps, exactly who was behind her and what the likely progression of the next 60 seconds looked like. She kept moving. The Admiral stepped directly into her path. They were not physically matched. He was bigger, uniformed, carrying the weight of 4 decades of institutional authority. She was smaller, in scrubs, pushing a gurney with a dying man on it. The situation had a logic to it that most people would have responded to by stopping, explaining, deferring. "Lieutenant?" He read her rank insignia with the automatic habit of someone who'd spent decades doing it. "You are interfering with a restricted formation event. Step away from that aircraft." Sir? Her voice was level. This patient has internal hemorrhaging. He needs surgical intervention that isn't available on this base. The flight to Northgate Regional is 17 minutes. If I don't get him there in the next 40, he will die. There are protocols. I've followed every protocol that can be followed in the time available. She met his eyes. She didn't blink. With respect, sir, step aside. Carrington's jaw tightened. Around them, the formation had gone very still in the way that 8,000 people can go still when they're all watching the same thing while pretending not to watch it. The ceremonial noise, the low hum of sound system feedback, the distant shuffle of feet, had stopped completely. "Get your hands off that gurney," he said. "Now." "Move," she said quietly, "or he dies." The slap happened so fast that several of the nearest personnel weren't sure what they'd seen until they processed it retroactively. It was open-palmed, not a fist, but hard enough that it snapped her head to the side and left a mark that would still be there 6 hours later. The sound of it, that specific sharp crack, carried across the parade ground with a clarity that silenced everything. For a moment, nobody moved. Nora's head came back to center. She touched her cheek once, briefly, the way you'd check to make sure something was still there. Then she looked at Carrington. Her expression didn't change. "Sir," she said, "I'm going to ask you one more time to step aside." What happened in the next 4 minutes was reconstructed afterward from 17 separate eyewitness accounts, 2 surveillance camera feeds, and 1 audio recording made by a civilian journalist who had the presence of mind to start his recorder when the shouting began. Carrington called for military police. 2 MPs arrived within 90 seconds, which was a testament to how thoroughly the ceremony had been staffed. They were given an order: detain the lieutenant, remove her from the flight line, and they followed it because that is what you do when an admiral gives you a direct order in front of 8,000 people. What they did not do, what nobody did, was stop Nora Hayes from completing the patient transfer first. She didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't do anything dramatic. She simply continued doing what she was doing with the MP's hand on her arm, talking the helicopter medic through the patient status, dictating medication dosages, confirming the receiving facility had been notified. She did it the way someone does a task they've been interrupted in the middle of and intend to finish regardless. The MPs, to their credit, seemed to understand on some level that stopping her from doing this would be the wrong call, and so they waited while she completed it, hands on her arms but not dragging her away. When the helicopter lifted off, Mercer stable, IV running, the medic with clear instructions, Nora turned to the MPs and said, "Okay." They handcuffed her in front of 8,000 people. She didn't say anything. She walked with them toward the east gate with her hands behind her back and her face completely neutral. Carrington watched from 10 meters away with the expression of a man who has just handled something and is satisfied with how it was handled. Sergeant First Class Ortega, who had been standing in the 3rd row of the 2nd Battalion formation and who had an angle on Nora's face as she passed within 20 feet of his position, would later tell his commanding officer that she looked less like someone being arrested and more like someone who was allowing something to happen because stopping it wasn't worth the effort. Ortega had 19 years in uniform. He had a reasonably calibrated sense of people. She wasn't scared, he would say. She was just waiting. The detention processing room at Fort Iron Ridge was a beige box with fluorescent lighting and 2 chairs, the kind of space that had been designed to make people feel the full weight of the institution they'd run up against. Nora sat in the chair closest to the door, hands still cuffed in front of her, a small concession from the younger MP who had decided that behind the back for a woman in scrubs was more than the situation required. She hadn't asked. He'd done it on his own. Sergeant Kessler, 26, 6 months at Iron Ridge, hoping to get moved to a real post before too long, sat across from her with the incident paperwork. He had the look of someone who understood that he was processing something that was above his pay grade and was trying very hard to just follow procedure. Name? Hayes? Nora M. First Lieutenant? Unit assignment? She paused for exactly 1 second. It was a pause that Kessler noticed and immediately decided not to ask about. KMO trauma, currently. He wrote it down. He asked the rest of the standard questions, and she answered them directly and without elaboration, and he was about halfway through the second page when his computer made a sound he'd never heard it make before. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for long enough that Nora, who was watching him without appearing to watch him, tracked the progression of his expression from routine processing to confusion to something that was moving quickly toward concern. "What is that?" he asked, not to her specifically. More to the screen. The system had flagged her ID number. Not with a routine hold, with a red border classified access alert, the kind that Kessler had been told about in his security briefing but had never actually seen in real life, because those alerts were for scenarios that happened at other posts, in other situations to other people. "Is there a problem, Sergeant?" Nora's voice was even. Kessler's fingers moved to the keyboard, trying a different access point. The alert replicated. He tried the manual override code. The alert expanded. "I'm going to need to call this in," he said. "That's the right call," she agreed. He picked up the phone and made the call to the administrative duty officer, and while he was on hold, while the hold music played its institutional nothing, the door at the far end of the building opened and closed. Kessler heard boots in the hallway. More than 2 sets, moving with the particular purposefulness of people who know exactly where they're going. Nora heard it too. She looked at the door. Outside, across 3 time zones, 3 separate secure communications channels had just lit up simultaneously, all of them routing to the same destination, Fort Iron Ridge. The paperwork in front of Kessler, the incident report, the conduct charges, the administrative hold forms, was already obsolete. He just didn't know it yet. And in the hallway outside the detention room, getting closer by the second, were people who very much did. The boots stopped outside the door. Kessler still had the phone pressed to his ear, still on hold, the administrative duty officer apparently having transferred him somewhere else in the bureaucratic chain, because that's what happened when classified alerts fired and nobody at the receiving end knew what to do with them. He was staring at his screen. The red border alert had been joined by a second one, different color, different agency header, and he had the expression of a man watching something collapse that he'd thought was perfectly stable 30 seconds ago. The door opened. Not aggressively, not with the theatrical force of a raid. It opened the way a door opens when the person on the other side has decided that what's behind it belongs to them, and they're simply coming to collect it. There were 4 of them. 3 men and a woman, all in tactical gear that wasn't standard military issue. The cut was different, the patches were wrong in the specific way of units that don't advertise themselves, and not one of them was carrying anything less than a sidearm with an additional magazine. The woman leading them was maybe 40, close-cropped hair, a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone who expected it to take hits. She didn't look at Kessler. She looked at Nora. "You look terrible," she said. "I've been awake 19 hours and someone hit me in the face," Nora said. "So?" "Yeah, we heard." The woman, no name offered, no rank visible, looked at the handcuffs. Something shifted in her expression. Not anger exactly, more like a person filing something away for later use. "Those coming off?" Kessler had hung up the phone. He was on his feet, which was the right instinct, but he hadn't gone for his weapon, which was also the right instinct, and he was running the math on the situation with the particular speed of someone who realizes that the paperwork in front of him is about to become extremely irrelevant. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see authorization." The woman turned and looked at him for exactly as long as it took him to understand that the authorization question was going to be answered in a way he hadn't anticipated. She held up a credentials wallet. The badge inside was not military. The header on the identification card was an agency name Kessler recognized from his security clearance briefings, the ones with the thick black lines redacting half the organizational chart. Kessler sat back down. He unlocked the handcuffs himself. Nora rubbed her wrists once, briefly, then stood. She was the same height as before, and somehow seemed to take up more space than she had sitting down. "Mercer," she said. "In surgery at Northgate," the woman told her. They got there in time. Barely. Nora let out a breath through her nose. It was the first visible sign she'd given of caring about anything emotionally since the slap, and it lasted about 2 seconds. "What do we have?" "Situation here is contained. Situation higher up is not." The woman gestured toward the door. "Walk with me. But They moved through the administrative corridor of the detention building, which was empty because everyone who'd been working there had apparently found reasons to be somewhere else in the past 4 minutes. That kind of spontaneous vacancy doesn't happen by accident. Nora noticed it and didn't comment. The woman beside her, she'd given a name by now, Valdez, no first name offered, walked with the stride of someone who'd spent years moving through hostile spaces and had simply never stopped moving that way, even in buildings with fluorescent lighting and motivational posters on the walls. Carrington filed the conduct charges before we could get the hold in place, Valdez said. Assault on a superior officer, insubordination, interference with a formation event. He was efficient about it. I'll give him that. He thought he was doing the right thing, Nora said. It wasn't a defense, it was a plain observation. He thought he was punishing a nurse who embarrassed him in front of 8,000 people. Valdez's tone was flat, which he was. He just didn't know what kind of nurse. They came out of a side exit into the service alley that ran along the building's eastern face. A vehicle was idling there, a dark SUV with government plates and tinted windows. 2 of the 4 tactical personnel were already flanking it. The desert air hit Nora's face, and she realized she'd been inside for long enough that the heat felt like a different world. "What's his clearance level?" she asked. "Carrington?" 4. Maybe a restricted 5 on the Navy side. So he can't access my file. Nobody on this base can access your file without triggering what Kessler's screen just lit up like. Valdez paused, hand on the vehicle door. Which means whoever authorized the charges is about to find out they've filed paperwork against someone whose official existence they're not cleared to know about. Nora looked at her. How long before that gets walked back to Carrington? Depends on how fast the Pentagon liaison on site figures out what he's looking at. Valdez considered. 20 minutes, maybe, if he's smart. Longer if he tries to resolve it through normal channels. He'll try normal channels first. They always do. Inside the vehicle, Valdez's phone was already active. 3 separate feeds running on a mounted tablet, all showing different communication threads. Nora looked at them without touching, reading fast. Who else knows Mercer was on base? She asked. On paper? Nobody. In practice, Valdez tilted her head. At least 2 people in base administration saw the transit room assignment and didn't ask the questions they should have asked, which means they might have answered questions from the wrong direction. Nora processed that. Carrington didn't know about Mercer specifically. He knew there was a medical patient and a nurse who wouldn't follow his timeline. That's all he knew. Then the ceremony was just bad luck. The ceremony, Valdez said, with the measured tone of someone who has spent years being precise about language, was a catastrophically timed collision between a classified operation and a man with a very rigid schedule. Back on the parade ground, the ceremony had technically resumed. Admiral Carrington had returned to the platform 11 minutes after the incident, straightened his uniform jacket, and addressed 8,000 personnel with the composure of someone who had decided that what had just happened was a contained and resolved matter. His aide had whispered something in his ear before he stepped up. Probably something reassuring, probably wrong. And he had accepted it with the ease of a man accustomed to aides telling him that things were under control. The address was shorter than planned. Not dramatically shorter, not in a way that would register to anyone who hadn't seen the original draft, but the Pentagon liaisons in the stands noticed. One of them, a colonel named Briggs, who had been in Washington long enough to develop a specific sense for when institutional situations were turning sideways, had spent the last 8 minutes on his phone with his jacket over his lap to conceal the screen. What Briggs was looking at was not good. He'd run the name. He'd run the ID number. He'd hit the same classified flag that had stopped Kessler's system, but Briggs had a clearance level that allowed him to see one layer deeper than the flag itself. Not into the file, not into the specifics, but into the administrative category of the file, which told him the category, which told him enough. He sat very still for the remainder of the address. When Carrington stepped down from the platform, Briggs was waiting at the bottom of the stairs with his jacket back on, and his expression arranged into the diplomatic neutrality of someone who needed to have a very difficult conversation and had decided to start it carefully. Admiral, a word, Carrington glanced at him, after the formation stand-down. It should be now, sir. Something in Briggs's tone caught. Carrington looked at him more fully. What is it? Briggs lowered his voice. The lieutenant you detained. I've run her credentials. And? A pause. And I think we should speak privately, sir. Carrington's jaw set. He was a man who did not like being told to go somewhere privately to be told something. He preferred information delivered directly, even when it was bad. This was a quality that had served him well in certain situations and was about to fail him comprehensively in this one. Whatever it is, Briggs, just say it. Briggs said it. Not all of it. He didn't have all of it. But enough. The flag. The category. The administrative indicator that meant the personnel file in question was managed at a level that Carrington, for all his rank, was not authorized to open. The Admiral stood at the base of the ceremony platform in the full Nevada sun, 8,000 people beginning to move through stand down around him, and his expression went through 4 distinct phases in roughly 6 seconds. Certainty, doubt, recalculation. Something that was not quite worry, but was adjacent to it. That can't be right, he said. I've run it twice, sir. She's a trauma nurse at a level 2 facility. She's been here. Her assignment here is logged as current. What's behind that assignment is not something I can see. Briggs kept his voice very even. But the flag category suggests that whatever is behind it is managed by an office that we do not typically interact with. Carrington looked across the parade ground toward the east wing. The gurney, the helicopter, the woman in scrubs. His mind replayed it with the unsettling quality of footage you've watched at normal speed and are now watching again slightly slowed. The way she'd looked at him. The absence of fear. The pause before she'd answered his questions. Small, almost nothing, but there if you were looking for it. He wasn't a stupid man. He'd spent 40 years reading people. Something had been wrong about the picture even in the moment, and he'd overridden that reading with his authority, which was something he'd done successfully 100 times and had never once cost him anything until now. Get me her commanding officer, he said. Briggs's expression shifted slightly. That's the part I haven't been able to establish, sir. In the SUV, Nora was reading a secure message on Valdez's tablet when her own phone buzzed. She looked at it. The number was internal to the base, routed through the KMO. She answered. Hayes. Lieutenant. The voice belonged to Major Whitfield, the KMO's administrative chief, a decent man who ran his facility well, and was currently sounding like someone who had been handed something very hot and didn't know where to put it down. I've had 3 calls in the last 10 minutes asking for your chain of command. I've given them your unit assignment, and the system keeps redirecting them. I know. A pause. Can you tell me what's happening? She thought about that for a moment. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was deciding how much Whitfield needed. He was not a bad man. He'd been kept out of the loop on Mercer's presence, which wasn't his failure. That had been handled above his pay grade. He deserved a version of the truth that would help him do his job. There's a situation being managed, she said. Mercer is stable. He's in surgery at Northgate. Who authorized the... He stopped himself. Right. Not my clearance. No. Another pause. Are you okay? It was a simple question, and it caught her slightly off guard, which was not a thing that happened to her often. She pressed 2 fingers to her cheek where the mark still was. I'm functional. That's not what I asked. It's the honest answer, Major. She kept her voice even, but not cold. Thank you for calling. She ended the call. Valdez was watching her from the driver's seat, not obviously, but watching. You're not going to file the assault report, Valdez said. It wasn't a question. That's not my decision right now. It is, actually. You're the injured party. Carrington hit me because he thought I was a nurse ignoring a direct order. Nora looked out the window at the low buildings of the service road. He was wrong about what I was. He was also wrong about the slap being an acceptable response to anything. Those are 2 separate facts, and they'll both be addressed through the right channels. She turned back. What I need right now is to know the status on Mercer's extraction window. Valdez accepted the redirect. He's out of our hands until he's out of surgery. After that, his transfer is coordinated through Langley's medical liaison. You're not on the logistics for that piece. I know, I'm asking because you want to know he's going to make it. Valdez said it plainly, without making it soft. Surgeons at Northgate are good. The bleed was controlled. Odds are reasonable. Reasonable. It was the honest word for a situation that didn't warrant better than reasonable, and Nora accepted it. "What's coming?" she asked. Valdez tilted her head toward the tablet. "Carrington has started making calls. His JAG rep is involved. There's going to be a push to maintain the charges on the grounds that he wasn't informed of and couldn't have been expected to know about, the classification status. Meaning he's going to argue he acted in good faith. He's going to argue he acted by procedure and the system failed to provide him relevant context." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Is he wrong?" Valdez considered. She was the kind of person who gave honest answers to difficult questions rather than easy ones. "About good faith? Maybe not entirely. About the slap? Completely wrong. About whether any of that mitigates what he interrupted?" She shook her head. "No." Outside the SUV, across the base, something was beginning to move. Not physically. The base had returned to its post-ceremony routine, vehicles moving, personnel dispersing from the formation grounds. But in the administrative layer, in the phone calls and secured message threads, and the chain of command that ran from Fort Iron Ridge to the Pentagon, and from the Pentagon to offices that didn't have public-facing names, a current had shifted. The charges Carrington had filed were still active, but the system that would have processed them had stalled completely, sitting with the frozen patience of a machine that had received two contradictory instructions and was waiting for a human to tell it which one to follow. That decision was about to be made, not by anyone on this base. Brigadier General Theo Alvarado was having the worst afternoon of his career, which was notable because his career had included a helicopter crash in a mountainous region he wasn't cleared to discuss, a congressional testimony that had lasted 11 hours, and a period of roughly 6 months during which he had been personally responsible for the safety of 3 people the world could not afford to lose. This was worse. He had received the alert 40 minutes ago. He had spent 20 of those minutes confirming what the alert was telling him, because the scenario it described was one he'd considered theoretically possible and had privately hoped he'd never see. A senior flag officer had physically struck a Tier 1 operative during an active classified operation. The operative's cover had been maintained through the interaction, barely, but the incident had occurred in front of several thousand witnesses, generating an incident report that was now moving through military administrative channels that absolutely could not be allowed to process it normally. He was on the phone with the Pentagon's Office of Special Operations Coordination when his aide put a second call through. The base commander at Fort Iron Ridge, a Colonel Dumas, who had just been notified by his own administrative staff that something had gone wrong and had apparently not yet been told what. Alvarado put the first call on hold. "Dumas. General, I have a situation here that You have Lieutenant Nora Hayes in a detention facility and an admiral who filed assault charges against her," Alvarado said. "I know." A silence. "Sir, I wasn't informed that..." "Nobody on your base was informed. That was intentional. What I need from you right now is confirmation that the detention hold has been lifted and that the lieutenant is in a secure status with the team that should currently be on your installation." Another silence, longer this time. Dumas was processing. He was a thorough man. Alvarado had reviewed his file before this call, which he'd made because thorough men were useful in situations like this, and also because he needed to know whether Dumas was going to be a problem. "The team arrived approximately 30 minutes ago. The hold has been lifted." "Good." "General," Dumas' voice was careful, measured. "Admiral Carrington is a 4-star officer. Whatever the classification status of the lieutenant's file, the incident report is going to be handled," Alvarado said, "at a level that Admiral Carrington does not currently have access to. What I need you to do, Colonel, is keep that administrative process from moving forward until I arrive." A beat. "You're coming here." "I'm already in the air." Alvarado looked out the window of the aircraft. The Nevada desert was spread below him like something drained of color by the sun. "ETA 70 minutes. Make sure Carrington doesn't do anything else." He ended the call. His aide looked at him from across the narrow cabin. Sir, the press pool that was credentialed for the ceremony. I know. 3 of them had cameras on the parade ground during the incident. Video footage is... I know. He turned back to the window. Below him, Fort Iron Ridge was too small to see, but he could picture it perfectly. The parade ground, the gurney, the slap, 8,000 witnesses, and however many cameras. How long before it moves? His aide checked something on her phone. Her expression shifted. Sir, it may have already moved. Alvarado closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he opened them and picked up the phone again. In a beige room at Fort Iron Ridge, Sergeant Kessler was staring at his monitor, which had now added a third alert to the first 2. This one with a header that he recognized and a code beside it that he didn't. A code that meant, according to his security briefing, that whatever file he'd been trying to process had been elevated to a review level that was not accessible from his terminal, or from this base, or from any standard military administrative interface in the continental United States. He had completed exactly 0 lines of paperwork in the past 40 minutes. He was also, quietly, and without any drama, beginning to understand that the woman he'd handcuffed in this room had let him do it, had sat in that chair and answered his questions and waited because she'd known exactly when the situation would resolve itself and had been content to let the clock run. Outside the building, a second vehicle had pulled up alongside the dark SUV in the service alley. The people who got out of it were not tactical. They were in civilian clothes, carrying nothing visible, moving with the quiet efficiency of people whose job was coordination rather than force. One of them walked to the SUV's passenger window and said something to Valdez that Kessler couldn't hear because he was watching through the building's single narrow window. He watched Nora Hayes get out of the SUV, say something brief to Valdez, and turn to look at the base. Even from this distance, even through a narrow window at an angle, something about the way she stood made Kessler's brain reclassify the past 40 minutes entirely. He'd been processing an insubordinate nurse. That's what his paperwork said. That's what his orders had been. The woman standing in the service alley looking at Fort Iron Ridge was not that. He didn't know what she was, but the alert on his screen, 3 of them now, stacked like warnings he'd been too far down the food chain to understand, was telling him she was something that his training had prepared him to follow instructions about, and nothing more. His phone rang. It was the duty officer. Finally. Kessler, the duty officer said, and his voice had the tone of someone who had just been informed of something they wished they hadn't been. Do not process any paperwork connected to the Hayes incident. Do not file. Do not forward. Do not log anything further. Leave everything exactly where it is. Yes, sir, Kessler said. And Kessler, the Admiral's JAG rep is going to call you in the next 20 minutes asking for copies of the intake documents. Sir? Don't give them anything, the duty officer said. And if they push, tell them the file is under federal review. Kessler looked at the window. The service alley was empty now. The SUV was gone. The woman in the scrubs was gone. Federal review, he repeated. That's correct. He set the phone down. He looked at the 3 alerts on his screen, and then he looked at the handcuffs still sitting on the corner of his desk, unlocked, which he had not put back in his drawer because he'd intended to get back to the paperwork and had never quite made it there. He picked them up and put them away. Across the base, in the commanding officer's conference room, Colonel Dumas had just informed Admiral Carrington that a brigadier general was inbound, ETA 1 hour, and that in the meantime the conduct charges against Lieutenant Hayes had been placed under federal review and could not be processed further. Carrington heard this. He sat with it for a moment in the way a large, confident structure sometimes sits for a moment before it begins to come apart. Federal review, he said. Yes, sir. A federal review of charges I filed against a nurse. Dumas did not correct the word nurse. He was not authorized to correct it, and also was not sure exactly what the correct word was. Yes, sir. Carrington's aide, standing near the door, made a small sound that he immediately converted into a cough. Carrington didn't look at him. Where is she now? Carrington asked. I don't know, sir. Carrington's jaw worked. He looked out the window of the conference room, a view of the administrative complex, the motor pool beyond it, the flat desert past the fence line stretching to the horizon. He had commanded ships, installations, joint exercises involving 4 nations. He had given orders that put people in danger and had lived with the outcomes of those orders. He was not a man who frightened easily or doubted himself often. Right now, he had the specific, cold sensation of a man who has reached out to break something and discovered that the thing has edges he never saw coming. "Get me Jag," he said, "and get me whoever runs that medical facility." "Sir?" Dumas hesitated. "Major Whitfield at the KMO says the lieutenant's chain of command isn't accessible through his office." Carrington turned to look at him. He says," Dumas continued carefully, "that when he attempts to route inquiries up through her unit assignment, the system redirects to an administrative hold." The room was quiet for a moment. "Who put the hold in place?" Carrington asked. Dumas looked at him steadily. "That information isn't available at this clearance level, sir." The words settled between them like something dropped from a height. Carrington was a 4-star admiral. His clearance level was not low. And somewhere, in a layer of the military's administrative architecture, he hadn't needed to think about until right now. There was a hold on a personnel file that he could not see, placed by an authority he could not identify, protecting a woman he had struck in front of 8,000 people. On his phone, a news alert appeared. He looked at it once and looked away. Then he looked back. The footage was already posted to 3 platforms. 17 seconds of video, shot from the stands by a credentialed journalist who'd had the presence of mind to keep his phone below the sight line of the nearest security personnel. The angle was imperfect. You could see his hand come down and her head snap sideways, and then the frame shifted and you could see her turn back to face him, calm as a person correcting a minor inconvenience, and say something that the audio was too degraded to catch clearly, but that the captions had transcribed as "move, or he dies." The video had been up for 11 minutes. It had been viewed 400,000 times. And in a corridor somewhere on this base, moving in the direction of the commanding officer's conference room, were the people who had come to collect Nora Hayes, and who were now, Carrington realized with a cold certainty he couldn't quite source, no longer in the business of simply leaving. They came in through the main administrative entrance, which was the wrong choice tactically, but the right choice symbolically, and Nora suspected Valdez had made that call deliberately. There were 6 of them now, the original 4 who'd come to the detention building, plus 2 who'd arrived in the second vehicle, and they moved through the corridor of the Fort Iron Ridge administrative complex with a particular kind of controlled presence that had nothing to do with speed or noise. They weren't rushing. They weren't announcing themselves. They were simply occupying space with the absolute certainty of people who had never once questioned their right to be somewhere, and the effect on the personnel they passed was immediate and consistent. Clerks stepped back from doorways, an NCO coming out of a supply room reversed course without being told to. A captain who'd been heading toward the conference room at the end of the hall took one look at the group, made a rapid calculation, and found somewhere else to be. Nora walked with them. She was still in scrubs, still had the mark on her cheek, still hadn't eaten anything since the granola bar at 0400. She was also, for the first time since the helicopter had lifted off the parade ground, completely focused on what came next rather than what had already happened. "Dumas is going to be cooperative," Valdez said low, not slowing her stride. "Dumas isn't the problem." "No." Valdez's eyes moved to the conference room door at the end of the corridor. "He's not." The MP stationed outside the conference room saw them coming and had the good sense to step aside without being asked. Someone had called ahead, probably Dumas, probably in the 30 seconds after he'd gotten off the phone with Alvarado, because Dumas was the kind of base commander who managed his exits and entrances. The door opened from the inside before Valdez reached it. Colonel Dumas was standing by the window when they entered. He was a compact man, mid-50s, with the careful face of someone who'd spent years managing situations that didn't have clean solutions and had learned to keep his reactions internal. He looked at Valdez. He looked at Nora. His gaze stayed on Nora's face for a half-second longer than was entirely professional, noting the mark, and then moved on. Admiral Carrington was at the head of the conference table. He had his JAG representative beside him, a lieutenant colonel named Pratt, who had the organized, neutral expression of a lawyer who'd been pulled into something fast and was still establishing the parameters. Two aides stood near the back wall. Carrington looked at Nora the way a person looks at something they've seen before but are now seeing in a different context. A face in a place it shouldn't be. A detail that doesn't fit the category it's been filed under. He didn't speak immediately. That was new. In Nora's experience, men who operated on the authority Carrington carried spoke immediately, as a reflex, because silence in their presence was an aberration to be corrected. The fact that he didn't said something about what the past 40 minutes had done to his certainty. Valdez set her credentials on the table without being asked, because this was the moment that defined everything that followed, and she was not going to wait for someone else to set the tempo. Agent Valdez, I work with an office that I'm not going to name in this room. Lieutenant Hayes has been under my team's operational coordination for the past 7 months. The patient she transported this morning is a classified asset whose identity and mission parameters are not available to anyone in this room below a Tier 3 clearance level. The conduct charges filed by Admiral Carrington this morning are being reviewed at the federal level and will not be processed through standard military administrative channels. Pratt, the JAG representative, picked up a pen. Under what authority? The authority is documented in the Federal Review Notice that should have reached your office by now, Valdez said. If it hasn't, that's a delivery lag. It's coming. Pratt looked at his phone. His expression shifted in a way that confirmed the notice had, in fact, already arrived. Carrington had not moved. He was watching Nora, not Valdez, with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a problem by staring at it. You were assigned to this base's trauma facility, he said finally. His voice was steady, but there was something working underneath it. For 7 months. Yes, sir, Nora said. Operational cover. Yes, sir. A muscle in his jaw moved. He was not a stupid man, and she'd never thought he was. That had never been the issue. The patient, Mercer, is not something I can discuss in this room at your current clearance level, she said. Not cruelly, just plainly. Carrington's eyes moved to Valdez. What's his status? Valdez considered him for a moment, the calculation of how much to give, which was itself a kind of answer. He's in surgery. He was in hemorrhagic shock when he was transported. If the lieutenant had waited 40 minutes for your ceremony to conclude, he would not have survived. The room was quiet. Outside, somewhere on the base, a vehicle engine turned over and drove away. Pratt set his pen down. He picked it up again. He was doing the legal arithmetic, and the numbers were not producing a comfortable sum. Admiral, he said low, leaning slightly toward Carrington, I need to advise. I heard it, Carrington said. What happened in the next 20 minutes was procedural in the way that consequences always are. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the grinding mechanism of institutional accountability running its course with the indifference of a machine that doesn't care about the people it's processing. Dumas facilitated. He was good at that. Moving people between rooms, managing the sequence of conversations, ensuring that the right people spoke to each other in the right order so that nothing that needed to happen got stuck behind something that shouldn't be in the way. He kept his own reactions internal throughout, and only once, when he passed Nora in the corridor outside the conference room while she was waiting for Valdez to finish a secure call, did he stop and say something directly to her. For what it's worth, he said, I should have been told. She looked at him. He meant Mercer. The transit room, the roster omission, the operational footprint on his base that he'd been kept outside of. He wasn't angry about it. He was stating a fact that he felt she should hear acknowledged. You're right, she said. That decision was made above both of us. I'm sorry for the position it put you in. He nodded once, accepted that, and moved on. She respected him for not pushing it further. The corridor was temporarily empty, and she used the 30 seconds of quiet to press her back against the wall and close her eyes. Not to sleep. Her body was well past the point where 30 seconds would help with that, but to run inventory. 7 months of cover, intact until this morning. Mercer, in surgery, odds reasonable. The mission objective, which she couldn't think about in specific terms, in a space this porous, but which she knew was still active, still running on the timeline that she and her team had spent 4 months building. The slap, which was a bruise and a legal complication, and also, separately, a data point about what happened when institutional authority collided with a situation it hadn't been briefed on. She was not fine. She was functional, which was what the mission required, and the distinction between those two things was something she'd deal with later, in private. In the specific way she'd developed over years of operating in environments where not being fine was a liability you managed quietly. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't have saved but recognized. Mercer, out of surgery, stable, asking for you. She typed back, "Tell him I'll get there when I can." A pause. Then, "He said you'd say that. He also said tell you the extraction window moved up 6 hours." She stared at that for a moment. 6 hours early meant the asset timeline had been compressed, which meant something had changed on the other end, which meant this situation, Carrington, the charges, the conference room, all of it, needed to resolve faster than she'd been building her patience for. She pushed off the wall and went back into the conference room without waiting to be called. Brigadier General Alvarado's aircraft landed at Fort Iron Ridge's airfield at 15:47 hours, which was 11 minutes ahead of his projected ETA, which was consistent with his reputation for arriving before people were ready for him. He was 60 years old, built like someone who'd stopped gaining weight when he left the field and hadn't changed since, with gray at his temples and the kind of eyes that had seen enough classified material to have stopped being surprised by most things. He wore his uniform the way career soldiers wear it at a certain rank. Not because he was performing for anyone, but because it was simply what he put on, the same way a craftsman reaches for the same tools every morning. His aide, Captain Ferris, had briefed him on the video during the flight. Alvarado had watched it twice on the tablet and not commented. He was met at the airfield by Dumas, who kept the debrief to 2 minutes and 40 seconds because he could read the general's pace, and by Valdez, who met him at the vehicle with the compact summary of a person who understood that everything important could be said in under 90 seconds if you organized it correctly. "Hayes?" Alvarado asked, as they moved toward the administrative complex. "Holding. She got a message about Mercer's extraction window. She's pushing to resolve quickly." "She's right to push." He looked at the base around him. The post-ceremony routine reasserting itself. Vehicles moving. The parade ground empty now. The sky turning the particular copper orange of late Nevada afternoon. "Carrington?" "In the conference room with his JAG rep. He hasn't made any additional moves since we walked in. He's reading the room." "He's a smart man." "He's a smart man who hit one of our people in front of 8,000 witnesses and 500,000 people online," Valdez said. And the flatness in her voice was not anger exactly, but the specific tone of someone who had placed something in a category and closed the folder. Alvarado absorbed that. "Where's Hayes now?" "With Dumas, going over the operational summary. She wanted it documented before we go into the formal session." He stopped walking. "She's writing the debrief." "She started it 20 minutes ago." He looked at Valdez with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, but occupied the space between them. "Of course she did." Chum. The formal session, which was what Alvarado called it, and what everyone else in the room understood to mean the thing from which there was no procedural retreat, began at 16:12. The conference room had been rearranged in the 40 minutes since the first confrontation, not dramatically, but functionally. The table seating had been reorganized so that Alvarado sat at the head, with Dumas to his left and Valdez to his right. Nora was positioned 2 seats from Alvarado, which placed her in the direct eye line of Admiral Carrington, who sat across the table with Pratt beside him and his 2 aides against the wall behind him. A court reporter had been brought in, a civilian contractor who worked with the base's legal office and who set up her equipment with the practiced calm of someone who had recorded a lot of conversations that nobody wanted recorded. Her presence changed the atmosphere in a way that all the credentials and agency headers hadn't quite managed, because a court reporter meant permanence, and permanence meant that whatever happened next was going to exist in the record. Pratt noticed her and said, "General, I'd like to note for the record that Admiral Carrington has cooperated fully with this review. The record will reflect what it reflects," Alvarado said, not unkindly. "Counselor, your client will have full opportunity to speak. Let's establish the factual basis first." He turned to Nora. "Lieutenant Hayes, I'm going to ask you to summarize the events of this morning beginning at approximately 0600, for the record and for the benefit of everyone in this room." Nora looked at the court reporter. The court reporter's fingers were poised. Nora began. She did not editorialize. She did not emphasize. She gave the morning in sequence. The call about Mercer, the assessment, the transport decision, the encounter on the parade ground. With the precision of someone delivering an after-action report, which was essentially what this was. Her voice was even throughout. She did not look at Carrington. When she reached the moment of the slap, she said, "Admiral Carrington struck me across the face with an open hand. The impact was sufficient to cause visible contusion and mild disorientation. I assessed the injury as non-incapacitating and continued patient transfer." Carrington was watching her. His expression was unreadable in the specific way of someone applying significant effort to keeping it unreadable. "The patient was loaded and airborne within 4 minutes of the impact," Nora continued. "I was subsequently detained by MPs under the Admiral's order, handcuffed, and transported to the detention processing facility. I was there for approximately 38 minutes before Agent Valdez's team arrived." She stopped. She'd reached the end of the morning in 7 minutes of testimony. Alvarado looked at Carrington. "Admiral?" Pratt started to speak. Alvarado held up a hand. "Admiral?" he said again, and his tone made clear that he was not asking the lawyer. Carrington sat forward slightly. "My account of the events is substantially the same. I will say that at no point during the incident was I informed of or given any indication of the lieutenant's actual assignment or the classified status of the patient." "That's correct," Alvarado said. "You weren't." "Then my response, your response to the situation as you understood it included striking a subordinate officer," Alvarado said. The temperature in his voice dropped by about 5 degrees. "Not detaining her, not physically blocking her, striking her." Pratt leaned toward Carrington and said something very quietly. Carrington didn't react to it visibly. "I acted under the impression," Carrington said carefully, "that she was a civilian medical officer in deliberate violation of a direct order during a restricted formation event." "She was a lieutenant," Alvarado said. The rank was visible. A pause. "Yes?" "And the standard response to a subordinate officer failing to comply with a direct order is not physical force." Another pause. Longer. "No, sir, it is not." The room absorbed that. The court reporter's fingers kept moving. Nora, who had been watching the table surface in front of her, looked up. "General, with respect, there's a timeline issue I need to raise." Alvarado looked at her. "Go ahead." "The asset extraction window moved up 6 hours during this session. I need to be involved in the coordination on that, and the longer this process takes, the more I'm not where I need to be." She kept her voice factual, not urgent, because urgency would read as pressure, and this room didn't need more pressure. "I'm not asking to walk away from the review. I'm asking for clarity on sequencing." Alvarado looked at Valdez. Valdez gave him a single, confirming nod. He looked back at the table. "We'll recess for 30 minutes. Agent Valdez, coordinate with the lieutenant on the extraction logistics. Dumas, I need you to arrange secure communications for that coordination. Pratt," he turned to the JAG representative, "use the time to review the federal notice. All of it this time." Pratt had the careful expression of someone who had read the federal notice and wished he hadn't. "Yes, sir." Carrington had not moved. "General?" His voice was level. "I'd like to know what charges I'm facing." Alvarado stood. He was not a theatrical man, and what he said next he said without drama, which made it land harder than any dramatic delivery could have. "That determination is still being made, Admiral. What I can tell you is that the determination will account for every decision made this morning, including yours." He left the room. The door closed without being slammed, which was somehow worse. The 30-minute recess was actually 43, because the extraction logistics were not simple, and Nora was not willing to sign off on a coordination plan that had gaps in it just because the clock was running. She and Valdez and 2 of the tactical personnel were in a smaller room 2 doors down, working off a secured laptop and a set of documents that Ferris had brought in from Alvarado's aircraft. And the conversation was fast and specific, in the way of people who share enough operational vocabulary that most explanations don't need to be made. "The pickup window is tight even without the 6-hour compression," Nora said, tracing a logistics route on the screen. If Mercer's not cleared to move by 2200, the medical team at Northgate says he should be stable enough for aircraft transfer by 1930, Valdez said. Should be is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It is, Valdez agreed, but the alternative is a 12-hour delay, and that's not viable given the asset timeline. Nora rubbed her face with both hands, a rare gesture, one of the few visible signs of the 19-plus hours without sleep beginning to stack up. Her cheek was still marked. She'd accepted a cold pack earlier, but hadn't kept it on long because she'd needed her hands. Who's coordinating the other end? She asked. Hollenbeck's team. She looked up. Hollenbeck's in theater. He rotated back 10 days ago. He's been on standby for Mercer's extraction since the operation started going long. That was actually reassuring, which meant she could trust the other end of the logistics chain and focus on the near side. Okay, I need to be at Northgate by 1900 at the latest. That means I need to be out of that conference room by 1800. Valdez looked at the time. It was 1704. Alvarado can move fast when the situation requires. The situation requires. Then it'll move. It moved. Alvarado reconvened the session at 1718 with the particular efficiency of a man who had decided that the deliberative phase was over and the consequential phase was beginning. He had been on 2 calls during the recess. Nora could read the residue of them in the set of his jaw and the slight change in posture that meant he'd received authorizations he'd been waiting for. He sat. He did not look at his notes. I'm going to address the record directly, he said, and everything I'm about to say is on it. Pratt had his pen ready. Carrington was still. His aides had stopped the small movements, the shifting weight, the exchanged glances, that people make when they're waiting for something to resolve. They were past waiting now. The patient transported by Lieutenant Hayes this morning is a classified intelligence asset whose mission directly supports an active national security operation, Alvarado said. That operation has been ongoing for 7 months. The lieutenant's assignment to this facility was operational cover, enabling her to maintain the asset's condition and provide continuity of care during a period when the asset's exposure risk was highest. He paused to let the court reporter's fingers catch up. The interruption of the patient transfer this morning was not a procedural matter. It was an interference with an active classified operation at a moment of medical criticality. Had the transfer been delayed by the 40-plus minutes that would have been required to wait for the ceremony's conclusion, the asset would almost certainly have died from hemorrhagic shock. The asset's death would have compromised the operation, endangered the individuals connected to it, and destroyed 4 months of intelligence work that cannot be recovered. The room was very still. Admiral Carrington, Alvarado said, turning to look at him directly, was not briefed on any of this. That is a fact. He acted on the information available to him. I acknowledge that. He didn't soften what came next. He also struck a superior classified operative in front of 8,000 personnel and a civilian press pool, generating footage that is currently circulating publicly and threatening to draw attention to an operation that depends on not being drawn attention to. And he did so because a woman in scrubs didn't stop when he told her to. Carrington's jaw was tight. He was looking at the table. The conduct charges filed this morning are being withdrawn, Alvarado continued, not because the incident didn't occur, it's on camera, but because processing them through standard channels would require disclosing operational details that cannot be disclosed. A separate review process will address the Admiral's conduct. Pratt looked up sharply. General, the nature of that review is not being determined in this room, Alvarado said. Counselor, I'd recommend you let that sentence land before you continue. Pratt landed it. He didn't continue. Nora had been watching Carrington throughout. His face had gone through something during Alvarado's summary, not collapse, because Carrington was not a man who collapsed, but a recalibration, the specific and visible process of a person absorbing information that requires them to reevaluate something they've held with certainty. He was doing it in real time, without flinching, which took a kind of character she could recognize even in someone whose decision this morning had made her life significantly harder. Mercer, Carrington said. His voice was subdued in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Alvarado looked at him. The patient. Carrington's eyes moved to Nora. Is he going to survive? She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the job," she said. Something in his expression shifted. Not absolution. She wasn't offering any, and he wasn't asking for it. Something more complicated than that. "I need to leave," she said to Alvarado. "Sir." Alvarado checked the time. "Dismissed, Lieutenant. Valdez's team will coordinate your transport." She stood. She picked up her phone and the folded logistics document from the table. She did not look at Carrington again. She was halfway to the door when his voice came from behind her, quieter than anything she'd heard from him all day. "Lieutenant." She stopped. She didn't turn around. A pause. "I'm sorry about the patient." Another pause, shorter. "And about your face." She stood with her hand on the door frame for 2 seconds, which was the amount of time she gave it. "Do better next time, sir," she said, and left. 1. The corridor outside was empty except for Valdez's people, and Nora moved through it at pace, her mind already running ahead to Northgate Regional. Mercer's post-surgical status, the transfer protocol, the aircraft she'd need, the window she was now working inside of. What she was not thinking about was the room she'd just left. She filed it the same way she filed everything that had already happened and could not be changed, acknowledged, assessed for relevant forward implications, and placed somewhere she could access it later when there was time to process it properly. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have seen from the corridor, was what was happening behind her in the administrative complex. Sergeant Kessler, who had been given no further instructions after the duty officer's call and had subsequently been sitting in the detention processing room reading the same paragraph of his operations manual for 25 minutes, received a visit at 1741. It wasn't Valdez's team. It wasn't anyone from the conference room. It was a woman in civilian clothes who identified herself with credentials from an office whose name Kessler immediately placed from his security briefing. Not the same office as Valdez, a different one, an oversight office, and who asked to see the intake documents from the morning's processing. Kessler, who had been told by the duty officer not to give those documents to anyone, said exactly that. The woman smiled at him in a way that did not reach her eyes and said that was fine. She didn't need the originals, she just needed to confirm they existed, because there was a separate federal inquiry that had been opened 30 minutes ago. Not the review of Hayes's charges, a different inquiry, one focused on the conduct of senior personnel during the incident, and the intake documents were relevant to that inquiry's scope. Kessler picked up the phone to call the duty officer. The woman from the oversight office watched him do it without showing any reaction, which told Kessler she'd expected him to make the call and wasn't worried about what the duty officer would say. He didn't get through to the duty officer. He got through to the duty officer's staff assistant, who was flustered and spoke quickly and said that yes, actually, the oversight inquiry was authorized and had been communicated to the post 30 minutes ago, and that Kessler should cooperate fully. He set the phone down. The intake documents, the ones he hadn't been able to file, the ones sitting exactly where they'd been since the morning, untouched, were now relevant to a federal inquiry into the conduct of a 4-star admiral. Kessler looked at the woman from the oversight office. She was still not reacting. She already knew exactly what he was going to tell her before he told her, because she had already seen what was on his screen and already knew what that meant. What it meant was that Admiral Voss Carrington, who had filed conduct charges against a classified operative, who had struck her in front of cameras and 8,000 witnesses, and who was currently sitting in a conference room 40 meters away being debriefed by a brigadier general, was now the subject of a federal inquiry whose scope Pratt, his JAG representative, had not yet been informed of. That notification was coming. Pratt's phone would ring in approximately 4 minutes. When it did, the expression on his face was going to tell Carrington everything he needed to know about how far this had traveled beyond a morning ceremony and a nurse who wouldn't stop walking. Pratt's phone rang at 17:45. He was still in the conference room, packing his legal pad into his briefcase with the organized movements of a man who was processing what he'd just witnessed and converting it into procedural steps, which was the only way JAG representatives knew how to handle things that had gone significantly sideways. Carrington was still at the table. His aides had been dismissed 10 minutes earlier by Alvarado, who had not explained why he wanted the room smaller, but whose tone had made the request non-negotiable. The ringtone was standard. Pratt looked at the screen, and the name of the office calling was not standard at all. He answered. He listened for approximately 45 seconds without speaking. During those 45 seconds, Carrington watched him the way experienced people watch other people receive bad news. Not intrusively, not with the pretense of not watching, but with the specific attention of someone who understands that the information coming through that phone is going to change the shape of the next several hours and needs to understand the shape as quickly as possible. Pratt said, "I understand," and ended the call. He set the phone on the table face down, which was the kind of small physical gesture that people make when they're buying themselves 3 seconds to organize what they're about to say. "Admiral," he said, "there's been a second inquiry opened." Carrington said nothing. He waited. "Separate from the federal review of the Hayes charges." Pratt chose his words with the visible care of a man walking across uncertain ground. The DoD Inspector General's office opened a conduct inquiry at approximately 17:15 this afternoon. The scope includes the incident this morning and any related decisions made in the 60 minutes prior to and following the formal incident. He paused. The basis for the inquiry includes the video footage, the eyewitness reports from formation personnel, and the intake documentation from the detention processing facility. The room held the particular silence of an outcome that has become inevitable being named out loud for the first time. Carrington's expression did not collapse. He was too experienced for collapse, and too honest with himself to pretend surprise. He had known, somewhere in the machinery of 40 years of judgment, that this was where the morning was heading. The knowing didn't make it smaller. It just meant he wasn't ambushed by it. "The scope," he said. "Does it include the slap specifically?" "Yes, sir." Pratt's voice was even. He wasn't softening it, which Carrington had always respected about good lawyers. The physical contact is the primary basis. Alvarado had been standing near the window since dismissing the aides. He turned now, not dramatically, just turning the way a person turns when the thing they've been waiting for has arrived. "Admiral, I want to be direct with you. The IG inquiry runs independent of my office. I don't control its scope or its timeline, and I don't intend to influence it." "I know," Carrington said. "What I can tell you is that cooperation at this stage will be relevant to how the inquiry proceeds." "I've been cooperative since Dumas told me you were inbound," Carrington said. Not defensively, just as a correction of the record. "You have," Alvarado acknowledged. "That will be noted." A beat. Carrington looked at the table, at nothing specific, at the grain of the wood or the middle distance, and for a moment he was just a man in a room with the weight of a morning that couldn't be taken back pressing down on everything. "The patient," he said. "Mercer. If Hayes hadn't moved when she did—" "He would have died," Alvarado said. "That's the medical assessment from the Northgate surgical team. Internal hemorrhage, advanced stage. The additional delay would have been fatal." Carrington absorbed that. He'd asked the question earlier when Nora was still in the room, and he was asking it again now because hearing it the second time was different from hearing it the first time. The first time, you're still processing the framework. The second time, you have to hold it. "She knew that," he said. Not a question. "She's a Tier 1 medical operative with 7 years of field trauma experience," Alvarado said. "She assessed the situation in real time. Yes, she knew." The silence that followed was not empty. It had texture. Pratt was writing something on his legal pad, which was his way of giving the Admiral a moment that looked like something other than a moment. Carrington straightened in his chair. He put his hands flat on the table, a small, visible decision to stop sitting the way a man sits when he's waiting for something and start sitting the way a man sits when he's accepted where he is. "What do I need to do?" he said, "for the inquiry?" Nora didn't know about the IG inquiry yet. She was in the back of an unmarked vehicle moving at 90 miles an hour on the interstate toward Northgate Regional Medical Center, with Valdez in the front passenger seat, running communications, and one of the tactical personnel driving with the particular focused calm of someone who had driven faster than this in worse conditions. The Nevada desert blurred past the windows in the copper late afternoon light, and Nora was on a secure line with Hollenbeck, who was already at Northgate and was characteristically blunt about the situation. "He's stable," Hollenbeck said. He had the voice of a man who'd grown up somewhere flat and windy and had spent 20 years being economical with words because the environments he worked in didn't reward unnecessary speech. "Post-op vitals are holding. Surgeons want 6 more hours minimum before aircraft transfer. We have a window that compresses at 2,200. I know about the window. Can he make a ground transfer if the aircraft isn't viable? A pause. The pause meant Hollenbeck was actually thinking about it, not dismissing it. Ground adds 4 hours minimum to the route. That puts us outside the window regardless. Then we need him on an aircraft by 21:30 at the latest. That's earlier than the surgeons want. I know, she said. What's his pain management status? Hollenbeck relayed what the surgical team had given him, including medication names, dosages, and post-op complications. A small bleed at the suture line that had been addressed but was still being monitored, blood pressure running lower than ideal, oxygen saturation acceptable but not strong. She listened to all of it, asked 2 specific questions about the suture line and about IV access for the aircraft, and processed the answers against what she knew about his baseline physical condition from 7 months of managing his care. I need to talk to the attending surgeon directly, she said. I figured you would. She's expecting your call. Nora ended the call with Hollenbeck and immediately dialed the number he'd texted her. The surgeon, Dr. Parrish, whose voice was brisk and confident in the way of people who operated in complex conditions and had developed immunity to being second-guessed, picked up on the first ring. Lieutenant Hayes? Doctor, walk me through your concerns about early transfer. Parrish walked her through them. She was thorough and she didn't minimize, which Nora appreciated. The suture line issue was the primary concern. Movement stress on an aircraft, even with stabilization, carried risk. The blood pressure was secondary but relevant. A transfer before 2,200 was not impossible, but it was not what she'd recommend given ideal circumstances. These aren't ideal circumstances, Nora said. I understand that. I'm giving you my medical assessment, not a recommendation about mission priorities. Those aren't my call. What can we do to the transfer protocol to reduce the suture line risk? They talked for 11 minutes. When Nora ended the call, she had a modified transfer protocol, a list of supplies that needed to be staged at Northgate before 2000, and a narrow but real window for a 2100 aircraft transfer if Mercer's vitals continued to hold. She texted Hollenbeck the supply list and turned to look out the window. The sun was getting low and serious. The highway stretched ahead into the kind of distance that Nevada does better than anywhere else, flat and enormous and indifferent. Valdez turned from the front. Status? Workable, Nora said. Narrow, but workable. Alvarado's team is going to want you back at Iron Ridge after the transfer. I know. The inquiry I know about the inquiry. She did, because Alvarado had told her in the corridor before she left. A quiet 30-second conversation that had consisted mostly of him telling her the scope and her telling him she'd provide a full written statement when the extraction was complete. He'd accepted that without pushback, which told her he understood that the mission wasn't paused for the paperwork. Carrington's going to have a hard few weeks, Valdez said. Not with satisfaction, just as an observation. He made a bad decision under incomplete information, Nora said. Then he made a worse decision about how to enforce it. The first part I can understand, the second part is going to cost him. Should. Yeah. She paused. Should. Northgate Regional Medical Center was a Level 1 trauma facility that served the Eastern Nevada corridor, large enough to handle complex surgical cases and experienced enough with military transfers to understand what it meant when the people picking up a patient had credentials that outranked everything in the building. Dr. Parrish met Nora at the entrance with the handshake of someone meeting a professional whose work she'd already encountered through the choices it had necessitated. Your field assessment was correct, Parrish said, walking fast. If he'd arrived 20 minutes later, the bleed would have been inoperable. I know, Nora said. I'm saying it because the people who'll write reports about this morning should know it too. Nora looked at her sideways as they moved through the corridor. Parrish had the look of someone who had heard the situation from Hollenbeck and formed a clear opinion about it and was not going to perform neutrality. Nora liked her immediately. Mercer was in a private room on the surgical recovery floor, which was itself a small departure from standard protocol that Hollenbeck had apparently arranged by being the particular kind of immovable that he was. He was awake, barely, in the way of people in post-surgical recovery whose anesthesia was wearing off in stages. And he looked at Nora when she came through the door with the expression of someone who'd been waiting long enough to move past relief into something quieter. "You look worse than I do," he said. His voice was rough and slow. "I've been awake longer than you have." She pulled the chair to his bedside and sat, not asking permission, and looked at his vitals on the monitor. "How's the pain?" "Managed." He shifted slightly and immediately regretted it. "What happened back there?" "Later." "I heard something about a general flying in." "Later, Mercer." He let it go, which was a sign of how tired he was, because Mercer was not a person who let things go easily. She checked his chart, confirmed what Parrish had told her, and assessed him in the way she'd assessed him 100 times over 7 months. Not just the vitals, but the totality, the color, the breathing, the specific quality of alertness in his eyes. "We need you on an aircraft at 2100, she said. He processed that. "That's earlier than—" "I know. Can you do it?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she valued about him. He didn't say yes to be tough. He actually considered the question. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Don't love it, but I'll do it." Parrish is modifying the transfer protocol. We'll have everything we need on the aircraft. Hollenbeck's coordinating the other end. Already in position. He closed his eyes for a moment. "The operation is still viable," she said. "We're inside the window." "Barely." "Barely is enough." She stood. "Sleep for the next 2 hours. I need you as functional as you can be." He opened his eyes again. "Nora." She paused at the door. "The Admiral," Mercer said. "What he did is being handled." "By who?" "The right people," she said. "Get some sleep." She closed the door and stood in the corridor for a moment with her hand on the frame, which was the closest she'd come all day to stopping. The hospital sound, monitors, soft PA announcements, the particular institutional hum of a building managing illness, pressed in around her. She was somewhere past exhausted now, into the territory where the body runs on obligation rather than energy. And the obligation was still there, and so she kept moving. Hollenbeck was waiting at the end of the corridor. He was 6'2" and had the kind of stillness that large, experienced people develop when they've learned that presence communicates more than motion. He looked at her face when she reached him, the mark on her cheek, and his expression shifted in a way that took about half a second and then was gone. "Full story," he said. "Later." "That's what you told Mercer." "Because later is when I'll have time for it." She took the folder he was holding. "Supply staging?" "Done. Aircraft is confirmed, 2045 wheels up from the Northgate helipad to give us margin." He fell into step beside her. "IG inquiry." She looked at him. "Alvarado's aide called me while you were with Mercer," Hollenbeck said. The inquiry scope expanded. They pulled security footage from the parade ground. Multiple angles, including 2 cameras that Carrington's people didn't know were positioned there. "What did the footage show?" "Everything from the moment the gurney came through the east gate to the moment you were walked out by the MPs. He kept his voice even, factual. "Including the slap, from 3 angles, with time-stamp correlation to the patient's deteriorating vitals as logged by the KMO monitoring system." The corridor was empty enough that they could talk. Nora processed the shape of what he was describing. Timestamp correlation. The inquiry team is building a timeline that maps the medical record to the incident record. The deterioration curve, the transport decision, the delay caused by the confrontation, the outcome at Northgate. He paused. "It's not circumstantial anymore. It's causal." Causal meant the inquiry wasn't just about whether Carrington had struck her. It was about whether his decision, the order to stop, the physical enforcement of that order, had created a direct chain of events that endangered a classified asset's life. That was a different category of finding. That was the kind of thing that didn't end with administrative review. "Who's leading the inquiry?" she asked. "IG rep named Soto. She flew in from DC with Alvarado's aircraft. She's been running interviews at Iron Ridge since 1730. Nora thought about Carrington sitting in that conference room while the institutional machinery turned around him, She thought about the 40 years he'd built, the ships, the commands, the discipline he'd maintained and demanded, the genuine belief she'd seen it in him, past the arrogance, past the reflex of authority, that order mattered and that what he'd done that morning was a form of maintaining it. He wasn't a monster. He was something more mundane and in some ways more tragic. A man who had used force against a situation he didn't understand and was now facing the full weight of what that force had actually touched. "Pratt's good?" she asked. "Pratt is good," Hollenbeck confirmed. "Whether good is enough is a different question." At Fort Iron Ridge, IG investigator Soto was 3 interviews in and had developed a clear view of the morning's architecture. She was 44 years old and had been doing inspector general work for 11 years, which meant she had extensive experience with the specific phenomenon of institutions that had failed to prevent something and were now doing the complicated work of both investigating the failure and deciding how much of the investigation's findings they could bear to fully acknowledge. She was not cynical about this. She understood why institutions behaved this way, but she was also not going to let it shape her findings. She had interviewed Kessler, whose account was straightforward and honest in the way of junior personnel who haven't yet developed the instinct to manage their testimony. She had interviewed Sergeant First Class Ortega, whose observation about Nora's demeanor, she wasn't scared, she was just waiting, Soto had written verbatim and underlined. She had interviewed the helicopter medic who had transported Mercer, a staff sergeant named Callie, who had given her a precise medical account of Mercer's condition during the flight and had said without being asked, "If we'd been in the air 15 minutes later, I don't think we'd have gotten there in time." She was now interviewing the civilian journalist. His name was Rourke. He was 31, credentialed for the ceremony through the base public affairs office, and he had the somewhat dazed quality of someone whose footage had been viewed by enough people that the situation had become significantly larger than he'd understood it to be when he was holding his phone at belt level in the stands. "I want to be clear," Rourke said, "that I wasn't trying to capture something controversial. I started recording because there was movement, and my instinct as a journalist—" "I understand," Soto said. "I'm not here about the recording. I need to know what you observed directly, not through the lens." Rourke collected himself. He described what he'd seen with reasonable precision. The gurney, the confrontation, the sequence of events as they'd unfolded from his position in the stands. When he reached the moment of the slap, he said, "I heard it before I processed what I was seeing. The sound it was very loud, louder than I would have expected." "And after the impact," Soto said, "the lieutenant's reaction." Rourke thought about it. "She turned back," he said. "That's the thing that struck me. She turned back to the patient. Not to the Admiral, not to the MPs, not to the crowd. She went back to what she was doing." He paused. "She said something to him. I couldn't hear it on the recording, so there's background noise, but I could read it. I was close enough." "What did she say?" "Move," he said, "or he dies." Soto wrote it down, though she didn't need to. The recording had it. The lip-reading analysis her office had already run confirmed it. She wrote it because writing it was part of how she thought, and thinking clearly was what this particular file required. She ended the interview with Rourke and sat alone in the small office Dumas had made available to her, looking at the timeline she'd built across 3 sheets of paper laid end to end. The medical record, the incident record, the communication logs, the video timestamps. Laid out linearly, the morning told a story that was not complicated. It was almost simple in its brutality. A man with authority had stopped a woman doing her job, had struck her when she didn't stop doing it, and the consequences of that interruption had come within minutes of being fatal. What was complicated was Carrington himself. She had his service record, which was extensive and largely excellent. She had his conduct history, which was clean. She had testimony from 3 of his aides, each of whom had described a demanding superior who was also, in the assessment of people who worked closely with him, fundamentally fair. None of which changed the footage. None of which changed the timeline. But it changed the shape of the inquiry's conclusion, because Soto's job was not to prosecute, that was someone else's function, but to establish what had happened and why and what systemic conditions had made it possible. The systemic condition in this case was specific. An admiral who had been given incomplete information about the nature of his installation's personnel had made decisions based on that incomplete information that had crossed into criminally actionable territory. The incomplete information was not his fault. The decisions were. She picked up her phone and called Alvarado. "I'm ready to proceed with the formal interview," she said. "Carrington or Hayes?" "Carrington first." She looked at the timeline. "And I need the complete operational file on Hayes's assignment, whatever I can be cleared for." A pause. "I'll make the call." "One more thing, General." She kept her voice level. "The JAG rep has been advising the Admiral to limit his cooperation pending the inquiry's scope determination. I'd recommend you communicate directly to Carrington that full cooperation at this stage is meaningfully different from limited cooperation in terms of how the findings read." Alvarado was quiet for a moment. "Meaning you think he might cooperate fully if given the right framework?" "Meaning," Soto said, "that he struck a woman in front of cameras because he thought he was right, not because he was trying to hide something. Men who do things because they think they're right generally find it easier to account for those things than men who are trying to conceal something. If Pratt has been telling him to manage his exposure, that advice may not be serving him well." Another pause. "I'll speak with him." "Thank you, General." She ended the call and returned to the timeline. Carrington's formal interview with Soto began at 19:02 and lasted 94 minutes. Pratt was present. He intervened twice in the first 15 minutes with objections to the framing of specific questions, and both times Carrington put a hand on his arm and said, "It's fine, Tom," and answered the question directly. By the 30-minute mark, Pratt had stopped intervening and was writing steadily on his legal pad, which was how a good lawyer recorded the answers his client was giving that would need to be worked with later. Carrington gave a complete account. He didn't minimize the slap. He didn't claim it was reflexive or accidental or less severe than the evidence showed. He described his state of mind, the frustration, the certainty that he was enforcing legitimate authority, the specific moment he'd made the decision, with the directness of a man who had spent enough of his life in high-stakes situations to understand that the cover-up is always worse than the act. "Why the physical contact?" Soto asked. "Specifically, you could have blocked her path. You could have ordered the MPs in immediately." Carrington looked at his hands on the table. "I acted from a place of authority that was, in that moment, absolute in my experience. I have given orders for 40 years and they have been followed. When they weren't, my instinct was enforcement." He looked up. "That's not a justification. It's what happened." "Had you ever done it before?" A pause. "Not with that, no." He met Soto's eyes. "No." She wrote something. "The patient, Mercer. Before this morning, were you aware of any classified personnel or assets attached to the KMO?" "No." "Were you briefed on any operational activity at this installation beyond standard training and readiness?" "No." "If you had been told that Lieutenant Hayes was a classified operative and the patient was a classified asset, would your response to the situation have been different?" He sat with that question for a moment. It was in some ways the hardest question she'd asked, because it required him to imagine a version of the morning in which his certainty had a different shape. "Yes," he said. "In what way?" "I wouldn't have stopped her." He said it plainly. "I would have cleared the path." Soto wrote it down. She noted the absence of hesitation in his answer. She would note it in her findings. At 20:44, while Soto was completing her notes and Carrington was in a brief recess with Pratt in the corridor, Alvarado received a call from the Pentagon's Office of Special Operations Coordination. He took it in Dumas' office with the door closed, and when he came out 4 minutes later, his expression had shifted in a way that Dumas, who had been managing the general's schedule and attention for the past several hours, noticed immediately. "Sir," Dumas said. Alvarado looked at him. "The inquiry is being elevated." Dumas waited. "There's going to be a criminal referral," Alvarado said, "from the IG's office to the JAG's Special Prosecutions Division. Assault on a military member, abuse of authority, interference with a classified military operation." He said it without inflection, because the facts were the facts. That last count is the serious one. Dumas absorbed that. "Timeline?" "Soto's filing tonight. The referral goes first thing tomorrow." Alvarado looked out the window of the office at the base lights coming on in the early evening dark. Pratt needs to be told. He'll recommend the Admiral prepare for formal charges. Yes. Alvarado was quiet for a moment. The Admiral has been cooperative throughout. That will be in the record. Does it matter? Alvarado turned to look at him. At sentencing, probably. For the referral? He paused. No. The footage is what it is. The timeline is what it is. At 20:58, Nora was in the Northgate helipad staging area watching the transfer team prepare the aircraft, and Mercer was being moved on a gurney from the elevator with Parrish walking alongside dictating final transfer notes to the flight medic. He looked worse than he had 2 hours ago, which was the honest reality of post-surgical transport. Movement did what it did, and managing it was better than pretending it wasn't happening. His vitals were holding inside the acceptable range. Barely. And Nora had had a direct conversation with herself about the difference between acceptable and good, and had landed on the position that acceptable was going to have to be enough because the alternative was worse. You're going to feel every mile of this, she told him when the gurney reached her. Notice that on the elevator, he said. The flight medic has everything you need. I've briefed her on your chart. She crouched to his eye level. I'm not going to be on the aircraft. He looked at her. Where are you going? Back to Iron Ridge. She held his gaze. There's testimony I need to give. He understood what that meant. He'd been tracking the shape of the morning from a hospital bed with limited information, but he was good at tracking shapes. Hayes. Mercer. The mission. Hollenbeck has everything. The operation is intact. You're going to get where you need to go, and this is going to be fine. She stood. Stop worrying about the mission and focus on not tearing that suture line. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, He hit you. I know. In front of... I know, Mercer. Her voice was not cold, just finished with the topic. It's being handled. The flight medic signaled readiness. The rotors were already running, the sound filling the helipad with the particular physical presence of aircraft that made conversation expensive. Go, she said. I'll be in contact through Hollenbeck. She watched the gurney board. She watched the doors close. She watched the aircraft lift off the pad with the slow, deliberate rise of something very heavy, deciding to be something that flies. Then she turned and walked back to the vehicle where Valdez was waiting. Iron Ridge? Valdez asked. Iron Ridge. They were 40 minutes out when Valdez's phone rang, and Valdez listened and then held the phone toward Nora. Alvarado, she said. Nora took it. Sir. Criminal referral is going to the JAG Special Prosecutions Division tonight, Alvarado said. Soto is filing her preliminary findings. I need your written statement at Iron Ridge before 800 tomorrow. I'll be there. Hayes. He paused. The statement needs to include the medical assessment, your real-time assessment of Mercer's condition, and the timeline for intervention. The prosecution's case is going to turn substantially on the causal chain between Carrington's decision and the threat to the patient's life. I understand. Can you do that tonight, given how long you've been awake? She thought about it honestly. Her hands were steady. Her mind was still running. She'd been in worse states, producing more complex output. Yes, sir. Good. Another pause. The extraction window? Mercer's in the air. Asset transfer is coordinated. Operation is intact. She heard something in the silence that followed that might have been relief, though Alvarado was not a man who expressed that particularly. Good work today, Lieutenant. She didn't respond to that. There wasn't a response that would have been accurate. Today had not felt like good work. It had felt like a series of decisions made under pressure, some of which had been right, and some of which she'd have made differently with more time and information. Mercer was alive. The operation was intact. Those were the metrics. I'll have the statement ready, she said. She ended the call and looked out the window at the desert moving past in the dark. Somewhere behind them, in a conference room at Fort Iron Ridge, Pratt was telling Admiral Carrington about the criminal referral and the 40-year career of a man who had never once had to consider that the wrong decision made with complete conviction was still the wrong decision, was entering a reckoning that had been set in motion at the moment his hand came down on a parade ground, and the woman he hit turned back to her patient without flinching. The vehicle moved through the dark. Nora was already composing the statement in her head. And back at Fort Iron Ridge, in the corridor outside the room where Pratt was speaking quietly to Carrington, Soto was reviewing the security footage one more time. Not the parade ground footage that everyone had seen, but a different feed, one that had been extracted from the KMO's internal surveillance system, covering the transit room where Mercer had been housed. It showed something that hadn't been part of anyone's account yet. It showed a figure, not Nora, not Atwood, entering the transit room at 0541, 14 minutes before Nora's call came in, 17 minutes before the monitoring system logged the first signs of Mercer's deterioration, and spending 4 minutes in the room before leaving. Soto had run the figure's face against the base personnel database. The result had come back with a name. The name was not in any of the accounts she'd taken today. She picked up her phone. Soto called Alvarado at 2119. He was in Dumas' vehicle, 20 minutes from the airfield where his aircraft was waiting, and he answered on the second ring because Soto did not call after hours for procedural updates. "Talk to me," he said. She talked. She was precise, and she was fast, which were the qualities he valued most in investigators. And what she described in the next 4 minutes reorganized everything he thought he understood about the morning. The transit room footage, the timestamp, the figure entering at 0541, the name that came back from the personnel database. The name was Warrant Officer First Class Dale Thurman. Thurman was 37 years old, assigned to Fort Iron Ridge's Logistics Coordination Office, and had been on base for 14 months. He had a clean service record with one notable exception. 18 months ago, he had filed a grievance against a superior officer that had been reviewed and dismissed. The superior officer named in that grievance was Staff Sergeant Dylan Mercer, then operating under a cover assignment at a different installation. Alvarado told the driver to pull over. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that someone accessed the transit room 14 minutes before the deterioration started?" "Yes, sir." "And that person had a documented grievance against the patient?" "A dismissed grievance," Soto said, "which, in my experience, tends to produce more resentment than a sustained one. The dismissal means the system told him he was wrong. People who believe they weren't wrong don't forget that." "What did he do in the room?" "The angle isn't perfect. He's near the IV stand for approximately 90 seconds. He doesn't touch Mercer. Mercer appears to be asleep throughout. He leaves. Nothing in his hands coming out that wasn't there going in." A pause. "But the IV access point shows what looks like a fresh mark in the footage, different from the nursing documentation from the previous check." Alvarado closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "Where is Thurman now?" "On base. He worked a standard shift today and signed out at 1700. He's in his barracks housing." "Don't touch him yet." "I know," Soto said. "I need Hayes' input on the medical side before I move. If the IV was tampered with, she'll know what to look for in Mercer's post-operative labs." The surgical team at Northgate documented his presentation on arrival. If there's a chemical signature in that blood work, it changes the charge profile from tampering to attempted murder. The words landed in the vehicle with the particular weight of something that reframes everything before it. Alvarado opened his eyes. Outside the window, the Nevada dark was total and flat, the stars overhead with the indifference of things that have been there forever. "Call Hayes directly," he said. "She's 40 minutes out from Iron Ridge. I'll authorize the contact." "One more thing, General." Soto's voice was even. It was the evenness of someone who had learned that bad news delivered cleanly was still better than bad news cushioned into incomprehensibility. "If the labs come back with what I think they'll come back with, Carrington's criminal referral gains a second dimension. He didn't just hit an operative. He stopped her from reaching a patient who had been actively poisoned." Alvarado said nothing for a long moment. "He still struck her," he said finally. "That doesn't change." "No, sir, it doesn't." She paused. "But the story of this morning just got significantly larger." Hush. Nora's phone rang at 2124. She looked at the number, didn't recognize it, answered anyway, because at this point in this day, unknown numbers were more likely to matter than not. "Lieutenant Hayes, this is IG Investigator Soto. I need 60 seconds of your time, and then I'm going to need significantly more of it." Nora had 60 seconds. She gave them. By the time Soto finished, Nora was leaning forward in her seat with her elbow on her knee and her hand pressed against her mouth, and Valdez, reading the body language, had already pulled out her own phone. The Northgate surgical team documented intake labs, Nora said. Her voice was controlled with the specific effort of someone controlling it consciously. What are you looking for? You tell me, Soto said. Something that would accelerate internal hemorrhage in a patient with a pre-existing suture wound. Something that would present as natural deterioration. Nora ran through it. She ran through it the way she ran through everything medical. Fast, systematic, without the luxury of uncertainty. Mercer had been recovering from a field injury that hadn't been fully disclosed to her when she'd first taken his case 7 months ago, which was standard for assets whose histories were compartmentalized. She'd pieced together the picture over months of monitoring, what she knew about his physiology, his medications, his specific vulnerabilities. Anticoagulant, she said. If someone introduced an anticoagulant at sufficient concentration into his IV line, it would extend and worsen an existing bleed without leaving obvious signs. It would look like his condition deteriorating naturally, especially if the original injury involved vascular damage. Which it did, Soto said. Which it did. Nora's jaw tightened. Call Parrish at Northgate. Tell her to run a full coag panel on the intake blood draw if she still has the sample. She should. Standard procedure is to hold initial intake samples for 48 hours. She thought for another moment. Tell her specifically to look for heparin or a heparin derivative, elevated anti-XA activity. If it's there, it'll be there. How long for results? If Parrish runs it as urgent, 2 hours, maybe less. Thank you. A pause. Lieutenant, Mercer is on the aircraft. If he received anticoagulant this morning, his current medications, I know. Nora was already pulling out her secondary phone. I'll call the flight medic directly. She has reversal agents on board, standard protocol. She stopped. She has them because I insisted on them. I always insist on them for aircraft transfers with post-surgical patients. The line was quiet for a moment. That may have saved his life a second time today, Soto said. Nora didn't respond to that. She ended the call and immediately dialed the flight medic. And in the next 4 minutes, she delivered instructions with the precision of someone who had given critical information under time pressure enough times that the mechanism was completely separate from whatever was happening emotionally underneath it. The flight medic, her name was Sergeant Dawes, 28 years old, good hands, exactly the kind of competent that didn't need to be told twice, acknowledged, confirmed the reversal agents were accessible, and said she would contact the receiving team at the destination to prep for a potential anticoagulation reversal protocol on arrival. Is he showing any new signs of bleeding? Nora asked. Vitals have been stable since takeoff, Dawes said. No new indicators. BP is actually slightly better than at departure. Keep monitoring, and Dawes, if anything changes, anything at all, you call me before you call anyone else. Yes, ma'am. Nora ended the call. She sat back. Outside the vehicle, the highway lights of the Raven Falls approach were beginning to appear on the horizon. Thurman? Valdez said. She'd been on her own call. I have his file. Talk. 14 months at Iron Ridge Logistics, unremarkable on paper except for the Mercer grievance. She was reading off her screen. But there's something else. Cross-reference on his financial records, flagged by a routine audit 8 months ago, not followed up. Multiple transfers to an account that traces back through 2 cutouts. Nora turned to look at her. The cutouts resolved to a foreign-linked shell company, Valdez said. We have a name on the other end, but I'm not going to say it in this vehicle. The implication was not subtle. Dale Thurman had not walked into that transit room out of personal resentment alone. Someone had paid him. Someone who knew about Mercer, who knew about the operation, and who had calculated that the best way to compromise a 7-month classified mission was to kill the asset quietly in a recovery room while he slept. The ceremony, the timing, the IV line. None of it had been coincidence or bad luck. The ceremony had been the cover, the confusion, the noise, the perfect window in which a man dying of what looked like natural medical deterioration would be processed as a tragic complication rather than a murder. If Nora had waited, if Carrington had succeeded in holding her back for 40 more minutes, If the parade ground hadn't had a woman in scrubs willing to keep walking while a four-star admiral screamed at her, she pressed her fingers to her eyes for 3 seconds. Then she took them away. Soto needs that financial information tonight, she said, sending it now. And Thurman cannot leave that base. Alvarado already has MPS on his barracks. Valdez put her phone down. He's not going anywhere. Nora arrived at Fort Iron Ridge at 22:11. She was 23 hours awake. The mark on her cheek had deepened to a bruise that had spread slightly toward her eye socket, and she'd looked at it in the vehicle's visor mirror without particular emotion. The way you look at a thing that has happened and cannot be unhappened. She was in the same scrubs she'd been wearing since 0400 the previous morning, and she would change them when the situation permitted and not before. Soto was waiting at the administrative building entrance. She was compact and direct and moved like someone who didn't have time for anything that wasn't essential, which meant she and Nora established a functional working rapport in approximately 30 seconds. Lab results from Northgate just came in, Soto said, walking. Elevated anti-XA activity. Heparin concentration consistent with external administration, not therapeutic dosing. So that was confirmed. Thurman, Nora said, in custody as of 20 minutes ago. He hasn't asked for a lawyer yet, which means he either thinks he's going to talk his way out of this or he's waiting for instructions from someone who isn't answering. Soto's expression was flat. Neither option is going to help him. What did he say when they brought him in? Nothing useful. He said he'd done a routine check on the patient as part of a welfare monitoring protocol. She glanced sideways at Nora. There is no welfare monitoring protocol for transit room patients in logistics. He invented it on the spot, and it was not a convincing invention. They moved through the corridor and into the conference room, which had been rearranged again. More chairs now, more people. The court reporter back in her position with fresh paper. Alvarado was at the head of the table. Soto took her seat beside him. Nora sat where she'd sat before, and the fact that the room was substantially more full than it had been that afternoon registered without requiring comment. Carrington was still there. He was at the same position at the table, but something had changed in the hours since Nora had last seen him. Not his posture. That was military straight, the discipline of decades. Something in his face. The particular quality of a man who has received information that has altered the moral landscape of his own actions, and is sitting in the new terrain deciding how to hold himself in it. He looked at Nora when she came in. She met his eyes briefly and then looked at Alvarado, because that was where the relevant action was. Lieutenant, Alvarado said, the lab confirmation. For the record. She gave it, clean and fast, the medical facts, the implications, what it meant for Mercer's situation, and what it meant for the morning. She watched the room absorb the word anticoagulant, watched the specific reactions. Pratt stopped writing. One of Alvarado's aides sat back slightly. Dumas's expression became very careful. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Thurman's financial records, Alvarado said to Valdez. Valdez summarized. She was concise and she was complete, and when she reached the foreign-linked shell company, she gave the name she hadn't said in the vehicle, and two people in the room who had high enough clearances to recognize it reacted in ways that were small but unmistakable. Pratt looked at Carrington. Carrington was looking at the table. Admiral, Alvarado said. His voice was quieter than it had been all day, not softer. Quieter in the way of someone who has moved past the performative phase of a difficult conversation and reached the real one. The morning's events took on a dimension this afternoon that I don't think either of us anticipated when we sat down. No, Carrington said. The man you were trying to protect your ceremony from was dying. Carrington looked up. His eyes were direct. Because someone put something in his IV line and she... He stopped. He looked at Nora for the first time since she'd come back into the room, and it was a different look than any he'd given her that day. Not the look of a superior to a subordinate. Not the look of a man caught in something. A look that had honesty in it, and the specific discomfort of honesty that has come too late to prevent its own consequences. She knew something was wrong, not what, but she knew. Medically, yes, Nora said. The deterioration rate was faster than his injury alone explained. I didn't know why. But you moved. I moved. He nodded once. It was a small nod, but it was not a casual one. Dale Thurman's formal interrogation began at 22:48 and lasted 3 hours and 17 minutes. Nora was not in the room for it. She was in the adjacent office writing her statement, which she'd promised Alvarado by 0800, and which she was going to complete on that timeline, regardless of what the rest of the night looked like. She wrote it the way she did everything demanding. Steadily, without drama, with the specific discipline of someone who understood that the quality of the document mattered more than the conditions under which it was produced. She heard, through the wall, the rise and fall of voices at various points. She did not try to parse them. The interrogation was Soto's domain, and Soto was good. What she learned afterward, through the summary Alvarado's aide brought her at 1:15, was that Thurman had held out for approximately 40 minutes before the financial record confrontation broke his willingness to maintain the improvised welfare monitoring story. After that, he'd cooperated with the specific desperation of someone who has calculated that the only remaining way to manage his situation is to give up the people above him before those people give him up first. He confirmed the anticoagulant. He confirmed the IV line. He gave the name of the handler who'd paid him, which matched the name Valdez had already traced, and he gave 2 additional names that were new, contacts he'd used for material acquisition, individuals who existed in the particular shadow layer between foreign intelligence services and deniable contractors. He did not express remorse. That was noted. The charges that were filed before dawn covered attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, espionage-adjacent conduct, and 3 counts under statutes that Nora had the clearance to understand and that would not appear in any public record. Thurman was moved to a federal holding facility before 0600, escorted by people who were not military police and whose organization's name was not on their credentials. He would not be returning to Fort Iron Ridge. Carrington's formal charges were filed at 0730 on a Tuesday morning in a proceeding that Pratt attended alone because Carrington had, in the end, waived his right to have counsel present for the reading. Assault on a military member, abuse of authority, interference with a classified military operation. The interference charge carried the most weight and the longest potential sentence, and it was the one that Pratt was going to spend the most energy on in the months ahead. The assault charge was on camera from 3 angles and was not defensible on the facts. Carrington had told Pratt as much before the proceeding, which had made Pratt's job both simpler and harder simultaneously. Simpler because a client who isn't fighting the facts is easier to manage. Harder because it meant the only available ground was mitigation, and the mitigation had limits. Carrington surrendered his command on the same morning the charges were filed. It was not dramatic. There was no ceremony, no assembled personnel, no formal transfer of authority conducted under dress uniform and the eyes of a formation. He signed the paperwork in Dumas' office with Alvarado present as the witnessing officer, and then he sat for a moment with the pen still in his hand, looking at something that wasn't in the room before he set it down and stood up. He was relieved of duty pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. His security clearances were suspended effective immediately. His access to base facilities was revoked. His command codes were invalidated, and the operational authority of 4 decades was transferred to an acting officer who would hold the position until the military could sort out the longer-term administrative consequences of what the morning of September 14th had produced. When he left the base, he walked to the vehicle that was taking him to temporary housing provided by his service, and he did not look at the parade ground as he passed it. Whether that was discipline or something harder to name, nobody who watched him go could have said. Nora submitted her statement at 7:48. She had been awake for 27 hours. She had written 11 pages of technical and operational account, precise and unsparing, and she had then written 4 additional pages that Soto had requested covering the medical assessment of Mercer's condition and the real-time decision-making that had led to the transport. Those 4 pages were the ones that would matter most to the prosecution's causal chain, and she had written them carefully. She sent the document, stood up from the desk in the small office she'd been using, and stretched her neck until it cracked in 2 places. Through the window, the desert was doing what it did at 0800 in September, burning off the night cold with the fast, impartial efficiency of a sun that had no interest in how anyone on the ground was feeling. Hollenbeck called at 0801. "Mercer's at the destination," he said. "Transfer complete. Receiving team has him. He's asking if you're okay. She laughed, which surprised her. It was a short, tired sound, not entirely happy. Tell him I've been awake for 27 hours and I have a bruise on my face and I'm fine. He's going to say that's not what he asked. I know. She looked out the window. Tell him yes. Tell him the honest answer is yes. She ended the call and stood for a moment with her phone in her hand, in the particular stillness of someone who has been moving at full capacity for so long that the absence of an immediate next action feels like a physical adjustment. Alvarado found her there at 0822. He knocked on the open door, which was the kind of small courtesy that distinguished the people Nora respected from the people she simply obeyed, and came in and sat in the chair across from the desk. He looked like someone who had also not slept, which was accurate, and he looked like someone who had made peace with that, which was also accurate. Statement received, he said. Soto's already working with it. Good. He looked at her for a moment. He was the kind of man who took his time saying the things that mattered, not because he was searching for the words, but because he wanted to be sure the words were right before he said them. What you did yesterday, the transport decision, the situation on the parade ground, the extraction coordination, the Thurman identification, any one of those things, handled correctly under that kind of pressure, would be notable. He paused. All of them in sequence in the same day, after 19 hours without sleep, is... He stopped. I was doing my job, she said. I know. He didn't push the point. He let it exist as what it was. There's going to be a formal commendation, for the record and for your file. Alvarado's office, countersigned by the deputy secretary. She looked at him. The deputy secretary was not a signature that appeared on routine commendations. The operation is intact, she said, because of you. Because of a lot of people. She meant it. She thought of Dawes on the aircraft with the reversal agents. She thought of Parrish running the labs without being told why. She thought of Hollenbeck, immovable and steady, managing the other end of a logistics chain that had never stopped even when everything else was falling apart. The commendation should reflect that. It will. He stood. Go sleep. That's an order, not a suggestion. I need to... There is nothing on this base that requires your attention in the next 8 hours that someone else can't handle, he said. Hayes, go sleep. She met his eyes. Then she nodded once, which was the full extent of what she was going to give in the way of compliance. He left. She sat for one more moment in the quiet office. She thought about Mercer in a receiving facility, being monitored by a team that knew what they were doing. She thought about Thurman in federal custody, working through the realization that the people who'd paid him had no more use for him than they'd had for any instrument they'd already used. She thought about Carrington, somewhere outside the wire now, beginning the process of accounting for a morning that had started wrong in the way that only the most ordinary of certainties can go wrong. The absolute conviction that you are right, and the catastrophic blindness that comes with it. And she thought briefly about the parade ground, about the sound of the slap, about the way 8,000 people had gone silent, about the fact that she'd turned back to the gurney, not because she was brave or because she was making a point, but because there was a man on that gurney who was going to die if she didn't keep moving, and everything else, the Admiral, the ceremony, the authority arrayed against her like weather, was just the environment she was moving through. She had not been fearless. She'd been afraid, and she'd kept going anyway, which is the only version of courage that actually exists in the field. Fear was just information. You took it, you assessed it, and you decided what to do with it, the same way you decided what to do with everything else. That was the job. That was what the job required. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Valdez. I'm going to sleep. Call me if anything changes on Thurman's contacts. Valdez replied in 30 seconds. Nothing's going to change on Thurman's contacts. Sleep. She walked out of the building into the September morning. The base was in its regular rhythm. Vehicles moving. Personnel crossing the road in pairs and small groups, going about the ordinary business of a military installation that had experienced something extraordinary and was now, as institutions always do, absorbing it back into routine. She walked across the service road toward the temporary billeting building, past the motor pool, past a maintenance crew working on something with the particular focused quiet of people who have a specific task and are getting it done. Two of them looked up as she passed. One of them, a young specialist, maybe 22, with grease on his hands, looked at her face, at the bruise, then at her, the whole of her, in the assessing way that people who have been on a base for any length of time look at someone they've heard about but not seen. He straightened. It wasn't a formal salute. He was mid-task, not in the position for it, but it was a clear, deliberate acknowledgement. His partner, registering it, did the same. Nora nodded to them. She kept walking. By the time she reached the billeting building, she had passed 11 people. 7 of them had done some version of the same thing. Not all with formal salutes, some with nods, some with the small physical correction of people pulling themselves to attention for a moment, in recognition of something they couldn't quite name but understood. The story had moved through the base the way stories move through closed communities, fast, imperfect, growing in the telling, and somewhere in its movement it had acquired a shape that the people on this installation had decided to stand up for. She noticed it. She didn't let herself make too much of it, because she knew how quickly collective memory reshapes itself, how the story being told about her today would be a different story by next month. She'd seen enough of that to have no illusions about it. But she noticed it, and she was human enough to let it matter, just for the length of the walk. She found the room she'd been assigned, a standard billeting space with a single bed and a window that faced west, away from the parade ground. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. They were steady, the same way they'd been steady all day, the way hands are steady when they've been doing what they were built to do. She thought about what it cost to stay in motion when everything in the environment is trying to stop you. Not the cost in the abstract, not as a concept, but the real and specific cost. The exhaustion that settles into bone. The careful management of things you can't afford to feel until the situation permits. The particular solitude of being the only person in a room who knows exactly how close it came. It had come close. Thurman's timing had been almost perfect. 14 minutes before her call. A quiet room. A sleeping man. A substance that worked slowly enough to look like natural failure. If the ceremony had run on schedule. If Mercer's vitals had held another 20 minutes. If she'd been assigned to a different shift, or if Atwood hadn't sent that text, or if any of 100 small things had gone differently. She stopped that line of thought. It was the kind of thinking that the job didn't have use for. What had happened was what had happened. What she'd done with it was on the record. Outside the window, the desert stretched west into nothing, into the flat, enormous silence that Nevada does so well, and the sky above it was the specific blue of early morning in a place with no weather to speak of, clear and unqualified and going on forever. She lay back. She was asleep in 4 minutes, but the formal commendation was entered into Nora Hayes's classified service record on a Thursday, 11 days after the events at Fort Iron Ridge. The language was precise and unadorned, the way military commendations are when they're covering things they can't fully describe in public-facing terms. It cited operational excellence under pressure. It cited medical judgment that had directly preserved an active intelligence asset. It cited conduct during an adverse incident that had reflected the highest standards of the service. What it didn't cite, because it couldn't, was the full picture. A woman in scrubs on a parade ground, a dying man on a gurney, and the particular kind of quiet strength that doesn't announce itself or wait for permission or stop moving when authority puts its hand in the way. Carrington faced a court-martial that opened 6 weeks later. The assault charge was resolved on the first day with a guilty finding that Pratt did not contest, in accordance with what Carrington had told him before the proceeding. The abuse of authority charge took 3 days of testimony. The interference charge took 4. The final sentencing stripped him of 1 star, mandated a formal reprimand that would follow his record permanently, and resulted in early mandatory retirement without the full benefits that a clean record would have earned. He did not appeal. In a written statement submitted to the court prior to sentencing, he said that his conduct on the morning of September 14th had been wrong in ways that his authority could not excuse and his experience could not justify, and that the only thing he could offer in account of it was a complete acknowledgement of what it had cost. Not to his career, but to the people who had been in the path of his certainty. Pratt told him the statement was not legally helpful. Carrington said he knew. Thurman's federal case moved through a different, less visible system, coordinated between the Justice Department and the intelligence community, and the names he'd given produced results that Nora received in a 2-page summary 5 months later. The handler he'd identified was expelled from the country under diplomatic cover. The 2 acquisition contacts were arrested by foreign law enforcement partners in separate operations 6 weeks apart. The financial network that had funded the attempt on Mercer's life was identified, partially disrupted, and placed under ongoing surveillance. Mercer recovered fully. It took 14 weeks, 2 additional minor procedures, and the specific stubbornness of a man who had decided he wasn't done yet, and then he was back. Nora heard about it through Hollenbeck, which was how she heard about most things related to the operational side of what she did. She sent Mercer a message. It said, "Good." He replied, "That's all you've got?" She thought about it for a moment and then typed, "I told you you'd make it." He replied with a single word that she read once and then deleted because it was the kind of thing that didn't need to be kept, only understood. People who knew her well, and there were not many because the life she led didn't produce the kind of knowing that comes from proximity, would have told you that Nora Hayes was not someone who spent time thinking about what she'd earned or what she deserved. She spent time thinking about what was in front of her and what it required. That was how she was built, or how she'd built herself, or some combination of both that she'd long stopped trying to distinguish. But there is a version of recognition that doesn't require you to want it for it to mean something. The kind that arrives not as ceremony, but as consequence, as the shape of the world reorganizing itself around the truth of what happened, without fanfare, without announcement, just as the simple outcome of not stopping when you were told to stop. She thought about that sometimes, about how much of what we call justice is really just the world being slow about catching up to what was always true. She had been hit in front of 8,000 people, and she had turned back to her patient. She had been handcuffed, and she had waited because waiting was the right use of that particular time. She had driven through the night to deliver her statement, and she had written it in an unfamiliar office while the interrogation happened in the next room, and she had submitted it before 800 because she'd said she would. She had not done any of it to be recognized. She had done it because there was a man on a gurney who needed a hospital, and because the work was the work, and because she had never once in her career confused her own visibility with the quality of what she was doing. That distinction between performing and actually doing is the one that matters. It is the distinction that gets lost most easily under pressure, when the cost of not being seen becomes very high and the temptation to make noise about your value becomes almost overwhelming. The people who hold on to it, who keep doing the work whether or not anyone is watching, who turn back to the gurney, those are the people who eventually don't need to defend themselves. The defense arrives on its own, 11 days later, in a classified file with a deputy secretary's signature, or in the way 2 soldiers straighten up from a maintenance task when you walk past, not because they were told to, but because they know. Nora Hayes walked back toward the trauma center on the morning she woke up, after 9 hours of sleep that had felt like falling and then like surfacing, and the base made space for her the way it had the day before, not dramatically, not as ceremony, just as the quiet and unmistakable acknowledgement of people who understand, even imperfectly, even through the distorting lens of rumor and incomplete information, that something that mattered had happened here, and that the woman walking past them was the reason it had mattered the way it did. She noticed it again. She let it matter again, just a little, just enough. And then she pushed through the door of the KMO, tied her hair back, and went to work.